Thank you. I hope you didn't raise too many expectations. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. As you can guess from my name, from my strong Italian accent, English is not my mother tongue, so let's try to help each other. Every time I say something that it's not clear to you, please raise your hands and we'll try to overcome the language barriers. Okay, as Professor Cosentino said, I'm here today on behalf of this group, No Grazie, which means no thanks. It's a group which was funded in 2004. It's composed mainly by health professionals, and we ask for basically we ask for a different relationship, a more transparent relationship between trade and health, and particularly between physicians and pharmaceutical companies. And what do? We give lectures whenever we are invited to seminars, conferences, and this is why I'm here today. And we also try to disseminate information on this thorny issue through, for example, a newsletter, free newsletter that you can receive if you just subscribe to the website. Okay, so I was asked to speak today about conflict of interest, particularly in scientific research. But first of all, I think it's important to try to understand what does conflict of interest mean. I think it's an issue that was raised quite a lot of times in the past few days. You received a lot of hints on this topic. I hope with this lecture to be able to give you some more food for thoughts on this thorny issue. So after trying to define what does conflict of interest mean, we will just focus on one single aspect. So conflict of interest in research and medical literature. And then, in the final part of this lecture, we will try to see some strategies to face the problem. Okay? So, what does conflict of interest mean? I think we all think that we know what conflict of interest is. And I think in most of the cases it's right, especially if you are Italian, because we have had so many examples of conflict of interest, especially among our politicians. But we can say that conflict of interest is part of what we could call the common knowledge, the common experience, the common wisdom, as all the proverbs show you. I took them from some European country. Maybe you will laugh reading some of them, but I think they describe quite precisely and in a provocative way what conflict of interest is. So, he who pays the piper calls the tune. Only in a mousetrap can you find cheese for free, or you don't bite the hand that feeds you. So, conflict of interest is an old concept that is part of the societal wisdom, but the first appearance of this concept in the ethical codes and in the medical literature was in the early 70s. And in the medical literature, there are so many different definitions of conflict of interest. And the one that I like the most is the one that was written by Professor Dennis Thompson, who is a professor of philosophy, political philosophy in Harvard. So what does he say? A conflict of interest is a set of conditions in which professional judgment concerning a primary interest tends to be unduly influenced by secondary interest. So we can apply this definition to whole disciplines, of course, but let's try to focus on health. So, which will be the primary interest that we should pursue? Guys, please help me. Don't leave me alone. As a health professionist. The primary interest that as a health professional you should pursue. What's your primary interest? The health of our patients, of course. If you are a researcher, which will be your primary interest? Yeah, the validity of the reproducibility, of course, of the outcome of your research, of course. And which will be the secondary interest that may unduly influence your judgment as a doctor, as a researcher? Money? Good? Of course, this is correct, but okay. So a familiar, let's say, interest, okay. Others? We have mentioned a lot of interest in the past few days. the first, let's say, idea is to focus on money. Of course, it's the first thing that comes up into our minds. But think also about the fact that these are the most kind of quantifiable ones, and so controlled. How more difficult it is to control a familiar interest, a personal interest, when you crave to become famous academics, or to have a lot of publications, or what about political interests, or, I don't know, religious interests also, okay? So, of course, the first, let's say, idea that comes up is money, but there are so many other interests, more difficult to quantify, and therefore more difficult to control, apart from money. The other interesting thing of this definition is that it says that conflict of interest is a condition and not a behavior. And I think this is really important because so we are not talking about, as we said a few days ago, bad apples or corrupt people. Of course, there are also these people, but this is something that is more, conflict of interest is a more common condition, and it doesn't imply a badly behavior. So it's just the condition that creates the conflict of interest. Even if you can either behave badly or in a good way after this condition in which you are. But just the condition creates the conflict of interest. And this allows us to differentiate the conflict of interest from what, in Italian we call it comparaggio. I don't know what's the English translation, but it's the situation when, for example, I am a doctor, I receive money from pharmaceutical representatives, and in return I have to prescribe a certain amount of his or her drug. This is an active behavior, and it is completely illegal behavior, of course. That's not what we mean by conflict of interest, because conflict of interest is just a condition. For example, I'm a researcher, I'm doing a research sponsored by a pharmaceutical company. This creates a situation of conflict of interest. Then I may be the most honest researcher in the world, but just this situation creates the conflict of interest. So was it clear, this differentiation? Okay. So we're not talking about bad apples, we are talking about really endemic conditions, because a lot of us are in a situation of conflict of interest. The other thing that I would like to say is that there are so many interests around health. Health is such a complex issue. So many conflicts of interest can arise. But today, we will focus on just a little aspect of this huge problem of conflict of interest. We will focus on the conflict of interest that can emerge between physicians and pharmaceutical companies. And we will use this just as a model, as a case study, to speak about dynamics that are more systemic. I could have chosen, I don't know, not big pharma, but big food. So the big companies work in the food sector, big tobacco, big alcohol. I could have chosen also this one. We will choose this one. Of course, it's something that is very close to what we work with every day, but it's just a case study, okay? It's just a model. So let's try to enter in this wonderful world of the relationship between physician and pharmaceutical companies. This article that was published in the British Medical Journal in 2003 uses this metaphor that I find is quite interesting. The article is called "How to Dance with Porcupines." Why? Because you know that during winter the porcupines go to their lair, they hole up, vanno in letargo, okay? And so they stay next to the other to not to feel, let's say, cold, let's say. But they're very clever animals because they know that they don't have to get too close one to the other. Otherwise, they bite themselves with their spines. So use this metaphor and use it to apply this metaphor to the relationship between physicians and pharmaceutical companies. I'm not saying that we should completely separate us from themselves. Good collaboration among these two actors can bring a lot of good things to the health of the population. We could not do our work as physicians without, for example, the drugs produced by the pharmaceutical companies. But as the porcupines, we should be clever, and we should know that if we dance this tango too close to them, we can bite ourselves. What does it mean? It means that we compromise our ethics, our independence, our integrity, and we could also damage the health of our population. Why? Because the two actors have two completely different primary interests. The primary interest of physicians, researchers, is to protect and to promote people's health. The primary interest of a pharmaceutical company is, of course, to increase, let's say, their profit for their shareholders. So there is a huge imbalance between these two different interests. And this is why the conflict of interest can arise. Are you following me? Am I speaking too fast? Okay. So, in order to start discussing about this problem, I would like to use a concrete example. And I chose the Vioxx saga. Have you ever heard about Vioxx? What happened with this drug? Should I tell you the story? Okay. I chose this one, but I could have chosen so many other sad stories, and I will tell you why. So Vioxx is an anti-inflammatory drug. The active ingredient is rofecoxib. So for those of you who are not doctors, don't worry. You just have to remember that this is an anti-inflammatory that belongs to a particular class of anti-inflammatory drugs. It's called COX-2 inhibitors. But what's the main issue is that probably you know that if you take, for example, anti-inflammatory drugs for a lot of time, you can get some gastrointestinal, let's say, problems such as ulcers. So this kind of anti-inflammatory drugs have less, let's say, a lower effect, a little effect on your gastrointestinal system. So you have a lower risk to get an ulcer, for example. So this drug entered into the market in 1999. It was approved by the US regulatory agency, which is called FDA, Food and Drug Administration. And it was hugely promoted to both the physicians and the consumers, because US, as Professor Catorini said this morning, US and New Zealand are the two only countries in the world in which you're allowed to do what is called direct-to-consumer advertising for prescribed drugs. Okay, in Italy you have just the advertising for the over-the-counter drugs, but not for the prescribed ones. Instead, in US, you can also advertise prescribed drugs. So it was there was a huge, really promotional campaign to push Vioxx, and really it soon became a blockbuster drug, so a bestseller. So drugs that can make you earn millions of dollars per year. But then there was some problem. There was some problem because in 2004, this drug was withdrawn from the market over safety concerns. Because, okay, it was good for your gastrointestinal system, but it was not so good for your cardiovascular system. So it's calculated that between 88,000 and 139,000 people had stroke or heart attack due to Vioxx. So an investigation started, and what came out was that Merck, which was the producer of Vioxx, withheld this information. So they knew that rofecoxib was not good for your cardiovascular system, but they continued to promote this drug and withheld this information from doctors and patients for over 5 years. It was a huge scandal. So when I read this story, I mean, the first question that came up into my mind was, how could this happen? And it would be easier, of course, just to blame one actor. Big Pharma, okay, they withheld the information, so they are the ones to blame. I don't think so. Of course, they have a huge responsibility in this saga, in this episode, but there are a lot of other actors that had a responsibility. I would call it a chain of co-responsibilities. So what about the regulatory agencies that were quite slow in withdrawing the drug from the market when the first signal of its cardiovascular effect came out? What about the researchers? Merck wrote a lot of what we call ghost-written articles, and a lot of academics just put their signature on it without knowing that they were spreading false information. What about the editors who published a lot of articles on Vioxx, which were ghostwritten by Merck? And on the other side, this time I would put the doctors who just prescribed many, let's say, tablets of Vioxx to their patient without knowing the risk that they were exposing their patients to. And of course, the patients who paid the high cost of all this situation. So, if you agree, we will start picking one by one all these actors, and we will try to see how they interact one with the other, and how they create these complex dynamics that can make this kind of episodes to happen. So let's start from Big Pharma. So Big Pharma is the collective name that is used to name the top pharmaceutical companies in the world, top 10, top 20 pharmaceutical companies worldwide. And we can say that Big Pharma has a huge influence on all these aspects of health, from pharmaceutical policies, not only pharmaceutical policies, I would say also economic and health policies in general, through a powerful lobbying activity towards our institutions, towards our governments. Drug regulation, we will see which are the problems of regulatory agencies and how they are funded by Big Pharma itself. On the scientific knowledge, and this is where I will focus on more in this presentation. And of course, on education, think about all the congresses, what we call CME, so continuing medical education, strongly financed by pharmaceutical companies. And of course, on drug description, this through all the marketing activities directed to doctors. But just for the purpose of this presentation, I will focus just on one aspect of this, and then if you want to know more about the other aspects, I will be happy to give you some hints, maybe at the end or later. So how Big Pharma is able to corrupt the process of evidence-based generation. And I would like to start with another case study. It's the study by reboxetine. It was already mentioned by Professor MacLeod in his presentation, I think on Monday. I don't know if you remember. But I find it interesting because Ben Goldacre is the author of this book, which is called Bad Pharma. In Italian, it was translated Effetti Collaterali. He's an English GP, so general practitioner, who starts in one of the chapters of this book. He describes how pharmaceutical companies corrupt the process of evidence generation, starting from his own experience as a general practitioner in the UK. So what does he say? That reboxetine is an antidepressant. Reboxetine is a drug that I have prescribed. Other drugs had done nothing for my patients, so we wanted to try something new. I read the trial data before I wrote the prescription and found only well-designed, fair tests with overwhelmingly positive results. So reboxetine was clearly a safe and effective treatment. The patient and I discussed the evidence briefly, and I agreed it was the right treatment to try next. So I signed a prescription. So far, so good. But this chapter ends with this statement, but we had both been misled. And why? Because as Professor MacLeod has already told you, when this research group from Germany, these researchers from Germany were able to analyze all the trials that have ever been conducted on reboxetine, both the published one and the unpublished one. What did they found? That 7 trials had compared reboxetine versus a placebo, and only one, the one with positive results, of course, was published. But the situation becomes more, say, worrisome when we look at the trials comparing reboxetine against other drugs. These trials were not published, and they showed that patients on reboxetine did worse than those on other drugs. So what's the disappointed comments by Ben Goldacre, who prescribed this drug for his patient? I did everything a doctor is supposed to do. I read all the papers, I critically appraised them, I understood them, I discussed them with the patient, and we made a decision together based on the evidence. In the published data, reboxetine was a safe and effective drug. In reality, it was no better than a sugar pill, and worse, it does more harm than good. As a doctor, I did something that, on the balance of all the evidence, harmed my patient, simply because unflattering data was left unpublished. And we've already spoken a lot about publication bias. So, after this description, Ben Goldberg starts to analyze the system that allows this event, like reboxetine, to happen. And where is the first problem that he analyzes? The first problem is that, in his opinion, there is a huge conflict of interest because we ask the pharmaceutical company to test the drug that then they want to market. Of course, this generates a huge conflict of interest because, as we said, the pharmaceutical company primary interest is to increase their profit. So let's enter into this world of research with Ben Goldberg, and we will try to follow the life of a drug from the lab to the, let's say, to the market. So who funds biomedical research? As we have already said several times in the past few days, pharmaceutical industry is the major funder. This is a study that was conducted, it was published on the Annals of Internal Medicine in 2010, and the researcher analyzed the trials on these 5 drugs that you see there that were registered in clinicaltrials.gov, which is one of the main database, the main registry of trials that we have so far. And what did they find? That industry was the major funder. You see the diamond? Industry was always the major funder for these 5 classes of drugs that they selected. But how much does, so Big Pharma is the major funder of research, but how much does Big Pharma spend in research? This is a study that analyzed the budget of 6 pharmaceutical companies. So where would you put the expenses in research and development? Which slice of this cake? 16? Who offers more? 31? Who offers less? Research and development of drugs. So who stands with the 16? Raise your hand. You don't. Who stands with the girl who said, sorry, I don't remember your name, the 31? I'll give you a hint, an help, but this doesn't help a lot. 32, 60, okay. That's it. So they spend in research, of course they fund a lot of research, but they spend in research and development just 1/3 of what they spend in marketing and administration. This is quite funny because they always tell us, okay, you have to pay a lot for my drug because I have to invest a lot in research and development. That's true, they have to invest a lot, but think about that the price of a drug is also determined by the expenses in marketing and administration. So if you're a doctor, every time you receive a little gift also from the pharmaceutical industry and also a pen, this will influence the final price that your patient will pay for that drug. So let's do another little step. How much does it cost to develop a drug? Any ideas? Let's think about the first, from phase 1 to phase 4. How much, to phase 3, sorry. How much does it cost in European? Just, it's not so easy. Other ideas? You want to try? No, the expenses in research and development. How much do they have to invest in order to study a drug from phase 2 to phase 3? Let's say like this. A lot. Okay? Okay, I made a mistake because I shouldn't have asked you this. Because the question, the answer is that we don't know. Or maybe we can add, it depends. Let's see why. This was a study that was done by a group of economists from the Tufts Center, which is a research center in Boston. And they, in 2001, they calculated how much does it cost to develop a drug. And they ended up with this number, $800 million. Now this study has been updated, and I think in 2006 it became $1.3 billion. Okay. So, but is it true? Let's think about it, because there is this interesting article demythologizing the high costs of pharmaceutical research that analyzes how this number came out. So this researcher from the Tufts Center invited 24 pharmaceutical companies to give their data, to share their data in order to calculate how much does it cost to develop a drug. And so they invited 24 companies, and just 10 agreed to share the data. So they gave the data on 68 drugs that were developed in the previous 10 years. But reading the article, you don't know which are the pharmaceutical companies, and you don't know which are the drugs. They could have just shared the data on the most innovative drugs and not on the Me Too drugs, and we will speak in a few minutes about Me Too drugs. And the other problem is that, so the researchers received the data from the pharmaceutical companies, but they were never able to kind of verify them, to check if they were really true. They just trusted the pharmaceutical companies. And the other thing is that they didn't make a lot of, I don't know, say, a calculation for the tax deduction, because what you invest in research is tax deductible, and they didn't make the adjustment for this, because you save a lot of money in the end. Okay, so I don't know if you can really trust this study, and I think it's quite interesting what Henry Waxman, deputy in California, says. The basic problem is that all pharmaceutical costs, including research, are in a black box, hidden from view. There is no transparency. And I found this lack of transparency very weird, because they tell us, pay a lot for my drug because I have to spend a lot in research. Okay, but I want to see. I would like to see. So another group, which is Public Citizen, which is an association that protects the right of consumers in the US, made another calculation. It's quite a gross calculation, it's a rough one, but I think it's still interesting. So they took all the money that the pharmaceutical companies said that they invested in research and development between 1994 and 2001, and they put it in the numerator. Divided, so in the denominator, they put all the drugs that entered into the market in the same period, so 1994, 2001. It's really a gross calculation, because not all the drugs, of course, not all the trials generate a drug that enter into the market. There are a lot of, I could call miscarriage or abortion, you could say. So it's not a precise calculation. But still it's interesting, because they end up with this kind of number, 100 million, which is quite far from the 800 million, now 1.3 billion, that was calculated with the other study. So where is the truth? I think we could say that we don't know how much they spend in research and development, and I would add that it depends. So if you are really developing a new, innovative molecule for, I don't know, for a disease for which we have no treatment up to now, probably you are spending a lot. Maybe you are spending also $800 million, I don't know. But if you're just developing another Me Too drug, and we will see in a few minutes what is it, I think you're not spending so much, and probably you're more close to the $100 million. How is it going? Am I running? No? Give me a feedback. Okay. Okay. So, which could be the problem of an industry-sponsored research? We have already spoken a lot about this, but can you guess? Which are the problems of research sponsored by pharmaceutical industries? We have already said a lot of stuff about this, but let's try to reiterate. Sorry? Depression? Ah, sorry, the pressure, okay. The pressure, of course. Of course, also depression, yeah, probably also depression, but the pressure, okay. I think we can categorize these problems in two main areas. So the research priorities, the influence of the sponsor on the research priorities, and the influence of the sponsor on the research methods. Okay, let's start from the research priorities, because of course, if a pharmaceutical industry or private industry, medical device industry sponsor research, the sponsor is the one who sets the priority for research. So the research doesn't cover all the diseases that we have in the world, but it just focuses on some diseases. Which one would you guess? Which diseases we are studying more? The one that have the cure? They don't have the cure? Cancer? Sorry? Where you can earn the most money. And where you can earn the most money? In which country you can earn the most money? from a public health, let's say, perspective, I would say, of course, the disease that affect rich countries, Western industrialized countries, where there are patients who are able to pay for that drug or for that medical device. And this is how for example, the 90 to 10 gap emerges. Have you ever heard about this gap? No? Okay, it means that 90% of the research worldwide is focused on studying diseases that affect just the 10% of the worldwide population. It's a huge, huge gap. And this is why we talk, for example, about neglected diseases. Do you know what does it mean, this term? You know? Would you like to help me? So I can rest a little bit. Anche in Italiano, also in Italian, then I translate. Neglected, they are completely forgotten. Which are these diseases? Are the diseases that affect the poor countries. Chagas disease, sleeping sickness, or African trypanosomiasis, schistosomiasis, leishmaniasis. So they affect a lot of people. Ebola fino all'anno scorso mi sembra molto attuale come esempio, infatti it's also Ebola. It's a well-known disease, but just now that is threatening our world, our Western countries, we are running to find a vaccine, otherwise who cares? So that's what neglected disease mean. And just to give you an example of this, I find interesting this study that was published in Lancet in 2006. So the researchers analyzed all the drugs that entered into the market from 1975 to 2004. So it was 1,556 drugs. Guys, just 21, so 1.3% were dedicated to find a treatment for tropical diseases and tuberculosis, which account for 12% of the global disease burden. This means that they affect a lot of people, but are people who are not able to pay. So the motto for the pharmaceutical industry is no cash, no cure. You don't pay me, I don't find a cure for you. And probably you have heard also about orphan drug. Do you know which are orphan drugs? Sorry that I mentioned there. Drugs for example, rare disease like genetic disorders. In this case, there are so few patients that the pharmaceutical industry is not interested because it will not be able to make a lot of profit. And just to give you an example, for example, of this problem of neglected disease, I would like to tell you a real story. I could have chosen Ebola, as the professor said. I could have chosen Ebola. But I will tell you about eflornithine. Have you ever heard about this story? No. Okay. So eflornithine is a drug that was registered by Aventis, now Sanofi Aventis, in the 1990s for the treatment of African trypanosomiasis, which is a neglected disease. Probably you know it as a sleeping sickness. So okay, the one transmitted by the fly, tsetse fly. Okay. So very good. But in 1995, Aventis stopped producing the drug. Why? Because they said that it was really costly to produce this drug, and in the end, they were not making enough profit. So they decided to stop. So the doctors who were treating patients with sleeping sickness were forced to go back to the old drug, which was melarsoprol, an arsenic derivative, very toxic, and there were also some resistances that were coming up for this drug. So not very good situation for the patients. But in 2000, something happened. And eflornithine is found to be effective to treat also another condition, which is called facial hirsutism. So it means that you have a lot of hair on your face. Okay. So could you guess what happens in 2001? Yes. Look at what enters into the market. Vanica, a cream for facial hirsutism in women. I'm not saying that facial hirsutism is not a condition that deserves a treatment, of course, but I hope you see the paradox, guys. So we had in the market what we could call the cosmetic drug, the lifestyle drug to treat this condition, but we had not the life-saving drug to treat patients with sleeping sickness. It's a huge paradox. But this story luckily ends well, because after years of international pressure, especially from Médecins Sans Frontières, coinciding with the period when media attention was generated because of the launch of Vanica, the cream that we saw before, Aventis decided to bring the drug back into the production. So now we have both the cosmetic drug and the life-saving drug. But not so many stories end so well, unfortunately. We will see what happens with Ebola, for example. Another problem that was mentioned also this morning by Professor Cosentino is what we could call the innovation crisis and the problem of Me Too. So Me Too means, in Italiano, farmaci fotocopio, farmaco anch'io. So what is it? It's a copy of a drug that already exists in the market. So you start a trial just maybe to modify a little bit a drug that is already in the market. For example, you can, I don't know, you can have the, I don't know if it's the right term in English, you have the Levogiro formulation, Levogiro, and you do the Destrogiro, and you say that the Destrogiro is better absorbed by your stock, and then you get, for example, a patent extension, and you can do a lot of profit from this. But is this the research that we need, guys? We will come back to this issue in a few minutes. Just to show you how big is the problem of Me Too drugs. This is a study that was realized by some pharmacologists from the University of Bologna. So what did they do? They analyzed all the drugs that were the EMA. EMA stands for European Medicine Agency, which is the European Regulatory Agency. So they analyzed all the drugs that the EMA entered into, allowed to enter into the market between 1995 and 2003. And they analyzed these drugs considering these three, let's say, aspects: the disease seriousness for which the drug was approved, the availability of treatment, so there was another treatment in the market to treat this condition, yes or no, and the therapeutic effect. And combining these three criteria, they obtained the final score of therapeutic innovation. So A, if it is an important innovation, B, moderate, and C, modest. And this is the result. So in the histogram, you see the red part represents the drug who we can, let's say, name as a huge, important therapeutic innovation. It's not a lot, guys. On average, it's less than 30. It's quite disappointing result because all the others are not so innovative. Maybe you could have also not have them, and probably nothing would have changed. And this is just a sort of funny thing. There is this independent drug bulletin. Do you know what's an independent drug bulletin? It's a journal that I suggest you to read because are journals that are completely independent from industry, both financially and intellectually. There are a lot of examples, not a lot, but we have also examples in Italy. Then if you want, I can give you some link to this, because I think they are really a good source of information if you want to be updated on drugs, not just relying. Independent drug bulletins. And so this is an independent drug bulletin from France. It's called La Revue Prescrire. And every year they would like to give this award to it's called Pilule d'Or, so the golden pill, to the industry that was able to develop and to enter into the market with a really new molecule entities, an innovative drug. So they want to give this award. But it's, I think, since 2008 that they are not able to give this award because according to them, no such a innovative drug entered into the market from 2008. So every year they meet hoping, oh, let's hope this year I will be able to give this award, but nothing from 2008. Of course, it's just their opinion, but I think it's quite meaningful. And so this article that was published in British Medical Journal in 2012 has a really meaningful title. So pharmaceutical research and development, what do we do? What do we get for all that money? So we are investing a lot, but what do we get in the end? So they say that since the mid-90s, independent reviews have also concluded that about 85–90% of all new drugs provide few or no clinical advantages for patients. So how have we reached the situation where so much appears to be spent on research and development, yet only about 1 in 10 newly approved medicines substantially benefits patients? oh my God, I think it's kind of an earthquake when I read this stuff. So what are we doing, guys? We're investing a lot in research and development. What do we get in the end? And I would add also, are we sure that the only research that we need is on drug and medical device and vaccine? How can we set the research priorities? Of course, the sponsors are setting them because they have the funds. But as Professor MacLeod showed you, if you ask people what they need, they don't mention always drug and device and vaccines. They would like also other kind of research. Okay? Are you ready for the next step? So we said the sponsors is setting the priorities, but the sponsor is able also to control the research methods. Controlling, for example, how the research is conducted, so that we get, as we already said, positive results. How the statistical analysis is done, how the article is written, and if or how the article is published. And the result, final result of all this is that, as we have already seen, I think Professor Cosentino have shown this, that studies sponsored by pharmaceutical companies are more likely to have outcomes favoring the sponsor. And the odds ratio is 4. So you have 4 times more probability to get a positive result if the study is sponsored. And this is the forest plot that show you the result of this study. And I've already told you. So how is it possible to control a trial? Let's see just some few examples. You can carefully choose the patient or the control group. This is what Ben Goldek describes very well in one of the chapters of his book. How? Maybe you can just play a little bit with the doses, a minimax manipulation of the doses. For example, if you want to show that your drug is less toxic, for example, have less collateral adverse effect, you can just use a lower dose, and vice versa if you want to show that your drug is more effective. You can just use multiple endpoints in the trial and select for publication those that give favorable results. We have already spoken a lot about clinical and surrogate endpoints, so I will not go into detail in this, but I would like just to tell you that I don't know if you know about rosiglitazone, the Avandia scandal. It's a drug to treat diabetes that, again, performed very well with the surrogate outcome. So it was very good in controlling the level of glucose in your blood. But if you look at the, let's say, clinical outcome, it was causing a higher risk of cardiovascular effects. So are we approving drugs on the basis only of surrogate outcomes? This is what could happen. Or you can have a look halfway at the results and maybe stop the trial if they look good. This happened with the CLASS study, a study that was conducted to compare Celecoxib, which was another drug similar to Vioxx, just to say a COX-2 inhibitor, compared to other 2 anti-inflammatory drugs. And as you can see, the results show you that Celecoxib has a lower risk of ulcer complication and symptomatic ulcer compared to the, let's say, conventional anti-inflammatory drug like ibuprofen and diclofenac. But if you look at what happened, this is what happened. So the trial was supposed to last 13 months, but they published the results only after 6 months. And after 6 months, Celecoxib was, which is the red one, was performing better than the other 2 drugs. If you look at the end of the study, the results are quite different. Celecoxib was not performing so well, but they just looked at the results before ending the trial and they published immediately without waiting for the end of the trial. Or you can present the results in a way that is most likely to impress your audience. For example, showing just the relative risk reduction and not the absolute risk reduction. Here is just an example, but I think this this stuff will be then further explored in the lesson that we will have on statistical analysis and so on. But just to have a look, for example, at the first row. This is a study that compared a statin with with a placebo. And if you look at the relative risk reduction or the absolute risk reduction, I think that the perception of risk and benefit is really different. So when you receive, for example, a depliant of a drug when you are in the ward, these depliant are not, for example, in Bologna, I give a lecture on this, on the problems of communication in the marketing strategies. They often show you just the relative risk reduction and not the absolute risk reduction and the number to treat. Just to, let's say, just to influence the way that you perceive this data. So you have always to pretend to see all the data, not just the relative risk reduction, which is the one used usually when they want to do a marketing activity. Or in the end, if the results are negative, you can just bury and hide them. And we have already spoken a lot about publication bias. So this is just a funny thing. This article was published in the BMJ in 2003. And these two researchers, Sackett and Oxman, what do they say? They say that we have always been good researchers in our life. But being good doesn't pay, because we didn't make a lot of money and we didn't make a wonderful academic career. So we are tired of being good and we will start to behave badly. What are we going to do? We will set up a company that we will call Harlot. Harlot is an acronym which means, actually Harlot in English means also prostitute. So they played with this name. But in this case, they want to say that Harlot is an acronym that means how to achieve positive results without actually lying, to overcome the truth. So what do they say? We set up this company and we will sell our services to drug and medical device company, and we will offer them a lot of strategies in order for them to get just positive results from their trial. And here they list some of the strategies that they will use. For example, the selective non-systematic review. If a pharmaceutical company wants to push its product, they can just cite those reports that support their product or policy and slag all the competitors. And here the payment that they will ask the pharmaceutical company is just pounds. If you want a minimax manipulation of your competitor's product, and we've already seen, you can play with the doses, they will ask to the pharmaceutical company an ocean front property in New Jersey. Of course, they're kidding. Or you can use, we can help you to find a surrogate and irrelevant endpoint, but in this case, we want lapis lazuli from you. Or at the end, you can just play with the communication of the data, so risk reduction instead of relative risk reduction instead of absolute risk reduction and number needed to treat. Ooh, and this time they want the 0.5% of the net sales, so a lot. But this is not the end, because they say after you have played with the data, you will need also our aftercare services in order to not allow the truth to come out and interfere with your sales. So you have lied, so now how can you not allow the truth to come out? Oh, there are several services that we can offer you. One is the SAFE. Say anything for €1. So you can just provide generous research grants, first-class travel, luxurious accommodation, exorbitant honorariums to whom? To experts who will favor your product. And then get, say, these SAFE experts that you have paid to, for example, enter the panel that generates the guideline, that writes the editorial, that becomes the referee for key journals. So the truth will never come out. Or you can use this interesting strategy, the SCOOM, 6 celebrities use in the media. Think about how many times we see stars of the stage and screen and famous athletes or politicians who speak about a certain health problem. They are probably disease-mongering that disease. They're paid maybe by the pharmaceutical company that could got them to talk on talk show, gossip magazines, and so on. Or another interesting strategy, I think, is the SOW, S-O-W, Save, Sacrifice, or Workers. So you just have to threaten the government. If the government wants to develop a policy that will threaten your finances, you just threaten them to move your product development and manufacture to another country. And the media will help you exaggerate this. And the doctor, so what's the power of the public in front of these huge multinational companies that are able to control all of these aspects? And when you try maybe to do something, to change something, to elaborate a policy, maybe you're threatened that the pharmaceutical company will fire your worker and move to another country. So we are really facing big powers, big multinational powers. So where does the public health stand here? How are you? Are you following me? Depressed. God, I know, I'm terrible. But now we will add another little piece to our puzzle, and we will analyze another actor. As I said, with the Vioxx problem, we have several actors that, let's say, play a role. And so the other actor, we have seen what Big Pharma does, but now let's move to another actor, so the regulatory agencies. So you all know, probably, which are the main regulatory agencies that FDA in the US and the EMA in Europe. So they evaluate the results of the trial conducted by a pharmaceutical company and decides if the drug can go into the market. So FDA and EMA should protect people's health and supervise big pharma activities. But there is this little problem. How is it possible if they are funded from 70 to 80% by big pharma? Because it's a paradox. So the one who is controlled pays his controller. So it's quite a huge conflict of interest again. And the other problem is the conflict of interest of the members of the panels who are judging these drugs. For example, the panel who had to, the FDA panel who had to decide if Vioxx could stay in the market or had to be withdrawn when the first events, cardiovascular events, started to appear. Well, 10 of the 32 members of this committee had huge conflict of interest with the pharmaceutical companies who were marketing, producing the COX-2 inhibitors. And they decided that the Vioxx could stay in the market. And at the end, it was Merck who withheld from the market because it was, of course, there were other problems. But so David Graham, I find it quite interesting what he says, who is the associate director of the FDA Office of Drug Safety. He says that the FDA, as well as EMA, for how they are structured, for their financial dependence and sometimes intellectual dependence on the pharmaceutical companies, they are not able to protect us against another Vioxx. And in fact, other Vioxx happened. For example, rosiglitazone, the Avandia case that I told you before, or paroxetine in the use of paroxetine, this antidepressant in children who increase the risk of suicide. And again, GlaxoSmithKline withheld the data. So, considering this situation, a lot of advocacy groups are pushing this regulatory agency to adopt new policy on conflict of interest. And EMA approved in 2011 a new policy on conflict of interest. So what do? They ask to all their experts to declare their conflict of interest. And then these declarations are published on a website that's accessible. And the other thing is that they analyze this declaration and they divide the experts in 3 risk categories. So risk 1, if you have no conflict of interest with the pharmaceutical company. Risk 2, if you have an indirect interest, for example, you have been paid for also travel to a conference or honorarium to give a speech and so on. Level 3, if you have a direct interest, for example, you hold stocks of that company. And so this is what comes out. If you see the red triangle represents the percentage of experts with a level 3 risk. You can see that Italy is second after Finland. There is a huge variability. On average, 16% of the EMA people, commissioner, let's say, experts, rank in the 3rd category. So, of course, it's important, and I think an important step towards more transparency. We have to see how and if this new policy will improve the way decisions are taken. And we will come back to the EMA later when we speak about the strategies, let's say, to face the problem. Okay? Any question? Should I add another little piece to our puzzle, the researchers? Or do you want me to stop because it's too depressing? I saw your face. Okay. Okay, the researchers. I will just give you some hints on these three problems that researchers and academics face. So the gagging clauses, the ghostwriting, and the conflict of interest, of course, of researchers and academics who carry out trials, and they have a lot of financial, let's say, conflict of interest with the pharmaceutical company who is sponsoring the same trial. So let's start from the gagging clauses. What does it mean? This article was done by was published on the Journal of the American Medical Association in 2006, and it was performed by the Nordic Cochrane Center. So basically, they analyzed the 44 trials who were given approval to go ahead in Copenhagen and Frederiksberg in these 2 years, 1994, 1995. And what did they discover? That 90% were sponsored by the pharmaceutical industry. Not a big surprise. For 16 of the 44 trials, the sponsoring company got to see the data as it accumulated. In a further 16, it had the right to stop the trial at any time for any reason. And there were constraints on publication rights in 40 of the 44 trials. And in half of them, the contract specifically stated that the sponsor either owned the data outright or needed to approve the final publication, or both. But the most worrisome thing is that none of these restrictions was mentioned in any of the published paper. So we read a paper and we don't know what happened behind, by which miracle this article appeared in the scientific literature, what happened before arriving there. And the let's say hardest thing is that it's also dangerous to speak about this, because when these researchers from the Nordic Cochrane Center published this article, the LIF, which is the company, the organization who protects, let's say, the interests of the pharmaceutical industry in Denmark, because this was published in Denmark, they sued the researchers from the Cochrane Center. They told them, they accused them of scientific misconduct, of having changed and manipulated the data. So an investigation started, and at the end, of course, the Nordic Cochrane researchers were good. They didn't do misconduct, but think about what does it mean for a researcher to face this kind of investigation, just because they were trying to speak about this problem, these gagging clauses, because it's common for researchers to be forced to sign project agreement that give the total right to decide on that trial to the sponsor, while this should stay also in the end of the researcher. And I would like to tell you about this Italian case that happened just 1 year ago. And it was published in the British Medical Journal in 2013. So the Mario Negri Research Center, it was mentioned also yesterday, it's a huge research center in Italy, in Milan. And they were contacted by the GlaxoSmithKline to perform a trial, a multi-center trial on, if I'm not wrong, on antibiotic resistance. Okay, but then look at what happened. They decided to not take part to this project, the Mario Negri research. Dozens of pages have made this study controlled by GSK and not a collaborative study. GSK outlined the complex structure for governance of the trial with committees and boards and voting rules that effectively gave the drug company total control. And again, that meant that we, researchers, would have had to ask GSK permission to access the data from our own trial, and that GSK reserved the right to block publication of our analysis of that data at any time after the study was completed. So they wrote this letter to the BMJ, and they decided to not take part into this trial. But how many, I know Mario Negri is really a huge research center. How many researchers are willing to do that in a situation of, as you were saying, there are structural determinants that force us to behave in a certain way? And again, we have to balance, okay, the structural system, but also us as a researcher, what are we willing to accept? To what extent are we willing to accept this kind of conditions? I think it's quite interesting. And this is just a cartoon, but it's not so far from reality, probably. The sponsors come to the researcher, and you're completely free to carry out whatever research you want, so long as you come to these conclusions that I give you before the trial starts. Okay, you're laughing, but probably it's not so far from reality. And of course, there is the problem that we have already analyzed in the past few days of ghostwriting and guest authorship. I'd like just to add this study, this survey that was performed by British Medical Journal in 2009. It was an anonymous survey. And what came out is that more than 20% of the articles have a guest author. So 20% of the people who were say surveyed said, yes, I put my name on an article that I haven't written. And of course, it's underestimating the problem because it was anonymous, but probably maybe not all the people told the truth. So probably it's an underestimate. And again, for example, in the case of Vioxx, a lot of articles were ghostwritten by Merck and its employees, and then academicians, famous academics, just put their name on it. And again, of course, there are the structural determinants that forces us to publish, but are we willing to accept this? Would you put your name on an article that you haven't written? And look at what happened with Vioxx, because then they were putting a name on an article whose results have been manipulated in order to hide the cardiovascular risk of Vioxx. And this, of course, is breaking all the criteria established by the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors on how authorship should be based. And all these criteria should be respected in order to be author of a paper. And I'm sorry, this is in Italian, but I didn't want to translate it because I think it's, I wanted to respect the author. It's a book called, named Il Fuoriuscito, written by Renzo Tomatis, who was the director of the International Agency of Research on Cancer. He worked there for 10 years, and then he decided to go back to Italy to do a clinical job. And he wrote this book after this experience, and he says, sorry, quando mi sono venduto, mi interruppe con una delle sue gran risate, oppure diciamo quando mi sono lasciato comprare, quando ho capito che la ricerca è il servizio del potere, che il ricercatore è un'oca che produce uova d'oro e che quell'oro andava tutto sulla tavola di chi comanda. Devo provare a tradurlo per chi si... Oh God, I'll try. So it's basically saying that the researcher is a kind of golden goose that is serving the people who have the power. So are we willing to be a golden goose for people who are making profit in the end of our work? So it's difficult to translate. Sorry, if you want to help me or add something. Just right? Okay. I think it's quite an interesting testimony from a person who worked in research, high-level research for years. So let's add another little piece to our puzzle. And what about the editors? I will give you just few hints on this because I think it will be the topic of one of the next day's lecture. So just few hints. The editors. We saw that, for example, in the Vioxx saga, the editors published a lot of articles whose results have been manipulated from the pharmaceutical industry or were ghostwritten. So why does this happen? This is an interesting article published on the Washington Post. The author analyzed the articles about new drugs that were published on the New England Journal of Medicine between August 2011 and August 2012. It was 73 articles, and of these, 60 were funded by a pharmaceutical company. Again, not such a surprise. 50 were co-written by drug company employees, and 37 had a lead author, typically an academic, who had previously accepted outside compensation from the sponsoring drug company. So why are they publishing this article that probably have some little problem? This is the answer by Richard Smith. Richard Smith is the former editor of British Medical Journal, and he published this article in which he says that medical journals and pharmaceutical companies are uneasy bedfellows, so scomodi compagni di letto in italiano. Why? And he says that many medical journals have a lot of pressures from the pharmaceutical industry because they have a substantial income from pharmaceutical companies, from the purchasing of advertising, because of course, pharmaceutical company give a lot of money to the editors, to the scientific journal, in order to publish the advertisement of their drugs on that scientific paper that will be read by millions of doctors in the world. And from reprints, do you know what are the reprints? Yes? Should I? Okay, when drug company publishes an article, a trial on a scientific journal, then usually orders millions of reprints, which are le ristampe in Italiano sarebbe, which are then used to market the drugs to doctors. So these are the articles that you receive when you are, for example, in your ward and the pharmaceutical representative arrives. It gives you one of the reprint to show you, oh, look at that. We published the article on Lancet and so on. So medical journals are strongly funded by pharmaceutical companies through advertising and reprints, and of course the sponsoring of supplements. So is this funding corrupting journals? And then there is another conflict of interest that can arise. The one linked to the fact that the editor wants, of course, to, let's say, increase the impact factor of his journal. And I found this interesting, this article, this editorial by Markovich on the PLOS medicine. Just as many clinicians claim that contacts by pharmaceutical company representatives do not affect their prescribing behavior, and there are a lot of evidence that they are influenced, so editors are likely to deny that thoughts of a rising impact factor might influence their acceptance rates. And the trials from the pharmaceutical companies increase a lot the impact factor of the journal, as this article shows. Again, another article written by the Nordic Cochrane Center. They analyzed 6 major medical journals, so British Medical Journal, New England, Annals of Internal Medicine, BMJ, and for each journal they identified the randomized trials published in these 2 periods and categorized the type of financial support. And in the end, they saw that the industry-supported trials were more frequently cited than trials with other types of support. And omitting them from the impact factor calculation decreased journal impact factors. So this is why the editors have a lot of interest in publishing industry-sponsored trials, because this increases their impact factor. And why? Have you looked at what they're saying? That the industry-sponsored trials are increasing the impact factor more than the non-industry supported trials. Could you guess why? Why do they generate a lot of citation, more citation than the other articles at least? No idea? First of all, because they almost always have positive results, and people talk a lot about positive results compared to negative results. We have seen that you have 4 times more probability to get positive results if you're sponsored. And then, could you guess another explanation of this? Because of course, the pharmaceutical industry set up a huge dissemination strategy. When they publish an article, then they immediately start disseminating the results through the reprints, asking, for example, to ghostwriter to write a review of that article, involving trying to catch the media attention. So this is why then, in the end, they have a lot more of citation compared to non-industry sponsored trials. And this increases the impact factor and could generate a conflict of interest for our editorials who are willing to publish a lot of these kind of trials. Okay? So what's the final result of all this chain of co-responsibilities? I find it quite interesting what Marcia Engel, which is the former editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, said. She says that industry-sponsored clinical research is a broken system. It would be naive to conclude that bias is only a matter of few isolated instances. It permeates the entire system. Physicians can no longer rely on the medical literature for valid and reliable information. I don't know what you feel, but when I first read this, statement, it was kind of an earthquake behind my foot. I mean, these are the evidence on which we take for example, our clinical decisions every day when we are in the ward, yes, in the hospital. Or these are the results that we use in order to implement the public health policies to protect and promote the population's health. Can we really call them evidence after all we saw? And let's go back finally to our GP from the UK, Ben Goldacre. At the end of this chapter, when he analyzes all these complex dynamics, he ends up saying that doctors can have no idea about the true effects of the treatment they give. Does this drug really work best? Or have I simply been deprived of half the data? No one can tell. Is this expensive drug worth the money? Or has the data simply been massaged? No one can tell. Will this drug kill patients? Is there any evidence that it's dangerous? No one can tell. This is a bizarre situation to arise in medicine, a discipline in which everything is supposed to be based on evidence. Whoa. How do you feel? So now there is the last part in which I'll try to give you some idea on what is going on, what is being implemented to try to face some of these problems. Do you have questions before I go on? Do you want to kill yourself? She's next to side. Okay. So how could we face the problem? It's not an easy answer. I think that probably we should combine two kinds of strategies. The top-down strategies, so laws, regulation, and the bottom-up strategies, so what we can do. Let's start from the top-down. There are some examples, especially from the US, as Professor Cosentino was saying before, in which they are kind of more advanced in this debate on how to face the problem of conflict of interest. And most of these strategies goes into the direction of more transparency. For example, this is a law that was approved in 2009 or 10, and it's called Physician Payment Sunshine Act, which sunshine because it wants to be, it would like to be a ray of sunshine in a dark situation. Dark because we don't know a lot about the relationship between physicians and pharmaceutical industry. So what does this imply? That it requires manufacturers of drugs, medical devices, and biologicals to periodically report the payments that they give to physicians, teaching hospitals, researchers. All these declarations are now available from September 2014 on a public database that everyone can have a look at, and it's periodically updated. So they have to declare everything, all the expenses that are more than $10. So it's a gift, it's a research grant, it's a travel to go to a conference, it's an honorarium. All of these have to be declared. Good step towards transparency. Who knows then what will happen, but at least try. Another, of course, move towards more transparency is the declaration of conflict of interest that you find at the end, you should find at the end of all these serious journals. And apart from this, you should also be able to look at which was the contribution of each author to that paper. So who did the statistical analysis, who collected the data. These are the information they should have at the end of the article. And when I speak with medical students in Bologna, I usually suggest them to start reading an article from the bottom. So first of all, you look at this declaration, and it doesn't mean that you have to throw it away. Not at all. But first read this, and then start from the beginning. It's kind of like if you put another pair of glasses in front of your eyes. So you read this information, but knowing which are the conflict of interest and the contribution of each author to this article. Of course, it's kind of an alarm signal, nothing more, because as we said, the declaration of conflict of interest is an alarm signal, because we said the conflict of interest is a condition, not a behavior. So it doesn't mean that this information, what the author says, is biased because of his conflict of interest, because it's a condition. But we have at least to be aware of it. But there are also some authors who are criticizing. Is not clear? Okay, sorry, no. Some authors are actually criticizing this strategy, the disclosure strategy, or at least are highlighting some of its limitations. The first limitation, in their opinion, and I find it quite interesting, is that disclosure may be perceived as absolving a person from their responsibility for managing their conflict. In Italian, we would say that it's come lavarsene le mani. So once you have declared, now you can do whatever you want. You can say whatever you want, you can write whatever you want on that article, and you're not responsible for managing that conflict of interest. And the other problem that they highlight is that the declaration the disclosure could be not just ineffective in the end, but also regressive. Because, for example, through this strategy called strategic exaggeration, if you are, for example, the author of an article, you declare the conflict of interest, and then you think, oh, maybe the audience will underestimate what I say because they saw my conflict of interest. So let's exaggerate my, for example, opinion. If I think that is, I'm just simplifying, that this drug is good, I will tell, oh, it's so good, wonderful, because I know that you will underestimate my, my statement. So it's kind of to balance. Was it clear what I said? It's not so easy to explain. Ok? No? Devo dirlo in italiano? No. Ok, cioè praticamente vuoi anticipare il fatto che abbasseranno comunque un pochino, faranno la tara a quello che dirai, e quindi uno potrebbe essere portato a esagerare la sua affermazione. Sorry. So, it's an interesting strategy, but there are, of course, some limitations. And it's not a panacea, of course, because just an alarm signal. It's not solving the problem. It's not a panacea. Other proposals, this comes from Richard Smith again. He suggests that journals should perhaps stop publishing trials. So the protocols and the results of the trial should be made available on regulated websites. Only such radical step, I think, will stop journals from being beholden to companies. Instead of publishing trials, journals could concentrate on critically describing them. This was also another proposal made by the Cochrane, by Tom Jefferson and Fiona Godley. They proposed this, what they say in this article, goodbye PubMed, hello raw data. So let's just publish the raw data on a website, and then the scientific journal will just publish critiques of this article, of this data, sorry. Okay, no. Was not clear? No. Okay, so you publish all the raw data in a website, and then the scientific journal just publish a critique, an analysis of the results, but not the results themselves. And on this direction goes a huge campaign that was launched in January 2013, which is called All Trials. Have you ever heard about this? So it's a huge campaign that was, let's say, signed by a lot of people, scientific journals, patients' organizations, research centers, single, let's say, doctors, and so on. And what do they ask? There is a website if you want to have a look at it. They basically ask 4 things. They ask for registration of all clinical trials. I know we already have some registry, but the problem is that they are not harmonized. So we have local registry, national registry, regional registry, then the EMA registry, the US registry. So let's try to standardize and harmonize the way we register the trials so that we can trace them easily. So after some years, we can go back and see, was this published, was this finished, and so on. So an harmonization of the registration of clinical trials. Then they ask the summary results reporting. So within 1 year after completion of the trial, the summary results, at least the main results of that trial, should be published in the same registry where the trial was registered before starting. At least so we have a general idea of what happened. And then the other thing that they ask is the full report. So to be able, especially for researchers who want to perform an independent analysis, to be able to access the raw data that the pharmaceutical industry used in order maybe to analyze them again and see if they can reproduce the same result. And also thanks to the All Trials campaign, some things are changing, some good things are happening. For example, EMA, so our regulatory agency in Europe, at the beginning of October 2014, approved a new policy on access to clinical data. And what does it mean? That from January 2015 onwards, the general public will be able to view on screen selected parts of trial reports submitted in support of marketing authorizations. And academic and non-commercial researchers will be allowed to download this data. So the public can view them on screen, the researchers can download and perform maybe other independent analysis. And this is a huge step, guys, because in the past, EMA was not so open and transparent. Several times, researchers asked to access the data that the pharmaceutical company gave to EMA. And what was the response by EMA? That they couldn't share the data because they had to protect they were kind of commercially sensible information. Guys, these are agencies that are created to protect the public health of the European population. And they say to independent researchers, we cannot give you the data because we have to protect the interests of the pharmaceutical company. These are commercially sensible data. I find this really, really unbelievable. From now on, probably EMA will be more open, more willing to sharing this data thanks to this policy, but there are still some problems. The first problem is that no proactive access to clinical reports will be retrospectively granted for medicines currently marketed. So this means that from 2015 onwards, we will have the data. But for all the drugs that we use every day, which were approved before 2015, we will have no access to this data. So they will be kept in secrecy. What about a retrospective policy? I would really like to see, to perform an independent analysis of a lot of drugs that we use every day. But for this drug, we will not have access because it's just for the new drug that will be approved in 2015. And the other problem is that they say that we will have access to selected parts of trial reports. And this means, according to some organizations like Health Action International, that pharmaceutical companies will have probably the right to redact some data, and probably this will allow them to control what data are released. So probably we will not have access to all, but to selected parts of this report. So, okay, we're opening the door, but not too much, just a little bit. Okay, so these were some examples of top-down strategies that have been implemented. But I think, and this is just my personal opinion, that what about the bottom-up strategies? I think that laws, regulations, new policies will never be able to replace the attention that each of us, that each of you should pay every day to your integrity, to your independence, to your ethics, with your behavior. So what I usually suggest to medical students is, of course, to avoid all the risky situation, avoid receiving gifts, avoid the sponsored congresses and conferences, even if it's hard, of course, because all the other people do in another way. You are the only one, maybe just crazy one doing this. Of course, critically reading the scientific literature, find independent ways, sources of information, and some sources we have some of them, for example, the independent drug bulletins. And the other thing that I find at least helpful for me is the idea that I'm not alone, that there are a lot of groups around the world, in a lot of countries, group of health professionals, group of researchers, group of medical students who are trying to do something on this issue, and have a look at their website, because some of them were really able to achieve some interesting results. For example, the EUAEM over there, it's a group of, it means Universities Allied for Essential Medicine. It's a group of medical students and physicians and political science students and law students, sorry. And they were able to achieve a huge results concerning the, for example, the access to medicine. For example, it was, I think, at the beginning of 2000, and the Yale University discovered a study to treat the HIV, and then they gave it to a drug company in order to produce it. And they received, of course, the royalties. After a lot of pressure from this group of students and MSF, of course, they linked with MSF, they were able to convince their university, Yale, to renegotiate the agreement with Bristol Myers Squibb in order to make this drug accessible at a lower price, at least in poor countries. This was done by students, guys. Students, of course, with the help of other professionals like MSF, but I wouldn't underestimate the people's power, I would say. Also, Professor Cosentino and I are involved in a little project with students, medical students, the Italian Association of Medical Students, on conflict of interest. They are organizing, let's say, trainings on this, research. Maybe we will not change the world, but something is happening. I think it's important to support these ideas. And I would like to end with two quite provocative statements. It's again in Italian, I'm sorry, but I didn't want to translate. I'll try to translate, but it was delivered in Italian, and I wanted to be honest with Gianni Tognoni. Is a pharmacologist who is the director of the Mario Negri Institute, the South Branch, because we have one branch in Milan and one branch in Chieti. And he says, basically says that conflict of interest do not exist. So I've been talking about nothing for the past 2 hours, because it's not a conflict of interest, it's a convergence of interest. He says that, first I read it in Italian, la medicina non è altro che l'espressione dei valori, poteri dominanti nella società in cui vive e si esercita. Da tempo questa società non ha come categoria e interesse di riferimento la risposta prioritaria e imprescindibile ai bisogni inevasi dei più deboli, ma l'adozione progressiva e premiata di una logica di affermazione competitiva di interessi privati. Cioè la medicina è parte di una società in cui i diritti umani, la salute delle persone vanno sempre al secondo posto rispetto agli interessi economici di pochi o molti che siano. E quindi la medicina si è adeguata. Ormai non c'è più conflitto tra medicina e salute, tra medicina, scusatemi, e mercato. Vanno a braccetto, secondo lui. C'è una pericolosa convergenza di interessi. Try to translate for you. Hai capito? Wow, grande. Mi risparmio una frase che sarebbe stata complicatissima. Non lo so, quindi c'è un po'... so what I would like to say is that is conflict of interest like a disease that we have to eradicate, a virus that we have to fight, or is just normality? It's just the common thing, an epidemic thing that we don't fight anymore, because it's not the anormal, it has become the normal. And I find it interesting also this statement by Vinay: conflitti di interessi sono sempre più presenti come sintomo di cedimento della società civile all'economia. So it's like the civil society is giving up, is retreating and leaving all the space to the economy, to market and their interests. So are we willing to accept it? It's up to you guys. I'm done.